Hi everybody, this video is about speciation. That is when there is the evolution or origin of a new species. Before we start to talk about how that is possible, I want to define two terms, microevolution and macroevolution. So microevolution is when we're looking at a specific species and how that species has changed over time, whereas macroevolution is something more broad. Like my example here is studying how feathers evolved in birds. So that's more than just one species. It's across many species, but we could look at the phenomena of how those feathers came to be. That would be an example of macroevolution. As I go through these notes, remember that the expectation is that you copy these into your notebook. So I'll probably talk faster than you're writing. Pause while you finish writing, and then keep going from there. You go at your own pace. So there's two types of speciation, two major ways that we could classify it. There's anagenesis. That is when one species becomes another species over time as it accumulates new traits. There's also cladogenesis. This is when there's a branching where there is originally one species, but then there is a branching event and there are two species later on. So this could mean that there's two different species that are distinct from this first species, or it could mean that this first species still is present, but there's a new species as well that's branched off from it. This is how we get cladograms or phylogenetic trees. We see those branching events. That would be cladogenesis. So we have that in words here as well. So anagenesis is the accumulation of heritable changes, and just over time, it's another species, versus cladogenesis, it's a new species is formed by branching from a parent species. I'm just going to leave the light off. I think we can still see it okay. All right, and as a definition, it's probably important that we can define species, right? So a species is a population that is able to produce fertile, viable offspring with other members of that population. So it's really important that every member of the population is able to produce viable offspring. Once you have part of the population that can no longer mate with part of the population, then that's a creation of a new species or the evolution of a new species. We'll talk about a couple of different reproductive barriers that could be in place that would cause that. So we classify these reproductive barriers into two main groups, prezygotic and postzygotic. So as a reminder, a zygote is a fertilized egg. So I have here my prezygotic barriers versus, and I've put above it an egg cell and a sperm cell to show that these are things that would happen before fertilization, whereas these are barriers after fertilization. So let's talk about prezygotic barriers first. So gametic isolation refers to the gametes of the organism. If the proteins, for instance, on the outside of the egg cell are not compatible with the proteins on the outside of the sperm cell, then the sperm cell cannot fertilize the egg. So there need to be proteins that act as receptors, and it's kind of like a lock and key method like we learned about when we talked about cell bio, that allows the DNA from the sperm cell to enter the egg cell. So that's gametic isolation. This is all in your book, by the way, page 506 in chapter 24. So all the details, and there's good examples in there too. Behavioral isolation has to do with the displays that organisms put on to attract a mate. So the example that your book has is blue-footed boobies, the bird, and they do a special dance where they lift up their feet. The males do a dance, and that always happens before reproduction. So behaviorally, if other birds aren't doing that dance to attract the females, then the blue-footed boobies aren't going to mate with those males from a different species. Temporal isolation has to do with time and place. So if in your book they talk about skunks that happen to have overlapping ranges during part of the year, but not during the part of the year when it is mating season, when they're actually reproducing. So those skunks aren't in the same place when it's time for them to reproduce, and so they're not going to reproduce with each other, and so they're separate species. Habitat isolation, exactly as it sounds, do the organisms live in the same place? So the example your book has is about flies, and there's two different flies. I think one lives with grapes and one feeds on grapes and one feeds on blueberries. So they are in different areas because the grapes grow over there and the blueberries grow over there, so they're not mating with each other because they have different habitats. So another example could be geckos that live really high up in trees and canopies in rainforests versus geckos that live closer to the ground. They're in different habitats. They're different strata of the rainforest, so they're not going to be mating with each other because they don't physically encounter each other. Mechanical isolation, the last one on our list here, that has to do more with like the physical limitations of reproduction in that organism. So your book talks about snails that have shells that spiral in different directions, and because of this, their reproductive parts cannot come together if they have the different spiraling, and so those are different species. They can't reproduce with each other. Post-zygotic barriers mean that fertilization happened. So the egg and the sperm came together, the DNA from the sperm entered the egg, fertilization happened, we have a zygote. Now what happens? Like there are still some hurdles that could prevent two groups of organisms from being the same species. Reduced fertility means that the offspring of the hybrid, so for example, a liger is a cross between a lion and a tiger. So the offspring of that lion and tiger, the liger itself, is not fertile. It cannot reproduce and pass on genes further. So that liger is sterile, and so that lineage is going to stop there. And so we continue to classify lions and tigers as separate species. Reduced viability. So that would be even though the sperm fertilized the egg, that zygote doesn't grow into a healthy, functioning organism. So it could be that that organism is still born, but it can't fend for itself, it can't find food, it can't live for very long. So viability, like it's not viable. Hybrid breakdown, which is the last post-zygotic barrier breakdown, that means that maybe we're getting past that point where we have a liger. So we have, say, it's a different set of organisms where there's the equivalent of a liger, and they mate and they have a baby, but their baby is not viable or is not fertile. So eventually, like in the line of here's lion and tiger, here's their offspring, we have breakdown. Like we cannot continue, that those organisms cannot continue to pass on their genes, and so we would call that breakdown, and it's another post-zygotic barrier. So those are all ways that we can use to talk about or distinguish populations of organisms as being different species. Moving on to talking about how one species can become two species, like how is that possible? How does that happen over time? So there are two ways in terms of geography that this could happen. Allopatric speciation is when we start with one pool of fish, for example. We start with one population that's all geographically in the same place, but something happens, maybe a drought, maybe, a landslide or something, and there's rocks in the way that separates those fish into two ponds. Over time, because those fish can't mate with each other, they're not spreading their gene pool, we're going to see genetic drift in those two ponds, and they eventually could end up becoming separate species. So they're geographically isolated. Whereas sympatric speciation is when there is not a geographic isolation. So these fish still can get to each other, but they evolved into separate species anyway. So that could have to do more with behavior or what they're feeding on or temperatures or something like that, but we see accumulation of two different species despite the fact that they're geographically still in the same place. So like Darwin's finches are a good example of this. Different finches ended up becoming better at feeding on different types of seeds and became different species even though they were in the same place. That's sympatric speciation. And I have that in words as well that you can copy down. Let's see if we can line this up so you can see it. Not very well. Okay, so as I said, allopathic speciation is when gene flow in a population is interrupted because it's geographically split, and this is when a population evolves into two species even though they are not geographically isolated. So go ahead and pause that if you need to copy it down, if you didn't already get it from the words that I was saying. The next thing I want to talk about is something called polyploidy. So this happens more in plants than in, say, mammals or insects. This is when more than two chromosomes get together and end up making a new species. So in humans, after our cells go through meiosis, we have sperm cells and egg cells. There's one copy of each chromosome. When fertilization happens, a zygote is formed. There's two copies of each chromosome, right? They're different. One's from mom, one's from dad, but there's two copies. So in plants, polyploidy can happen where there's 3 chromosomes or 4, depending on the plant species. They could be from different species of plants, and as a result, you get a third, a totally new species of plant. So again, that's something kind of weird or different that happens not in humans and not in mammals, but polys, multiple, ploidy, like diploid or haploid. That's how you can recognize that word. And last but not least is something called adaptive radiation. So this is when an organism is in a pretty fertile area. It's wide open. There's not a lot of competition. And as a result, like Darwin's finches, you might end up seeing a huge variety of species evolve. So here I have one plant in the center, and I am showing that there's different plants that are selected for over time, like a cactus or a tree or a bush. So over time, because there's so much abundance in space, maybe in this small population, the features of a shorter plant that's bushier with leaves are selected for over time. They reproduce better, produce more offspring. Whereas maybe over here, the cactus, the spines or the ability to close stoma so that water doesn't escape is selected for over time. So those are the key terms that you need to know about speciation. Make sure you've taken all of the notes that you need to and ask me questions if you have them.